September 25, 1915. Lucengohel, France. Rain drummed on the mud-blackened helmets of soldiers crouched in the British trenches. The air reeked of cordite and wet wool. Beyond the parapet, the grey morning blurred into no man's land, a morass of shell holes and twisted wire. Private Arthur Hensley of the 8th Battalion, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, wiped his sleeve across his brow and squinted toward the German lines. The whistle would blow soon. He felt the weight of the new thing on his head, a dull, steel bowl that looked, to many, more like a soup dish than protection. Tin hat! The men had called it when it was issued just a week ago. Some laughed, others cursed it for being heavy and ugly. But the order was clear. All troops were to wear the new Brodie helmet. Across the lines, German troops spotted them through binoculars. One officer, Lieutenant Franz Eberhardt, smirked. Die Engländer mit ihren Kochtopfen, he said, the Englishmen with their cooking pots. His men chuckled as they passed the comment down the trench. The Germans wore soft pickelhaube leather helmets, adorned with brass spikes that once gleamed in parade squares but now drooped, soaked with rain and coated in mud. At 6:30 a.m., whistles screamed through the drizzle. Hensley's heart thudded as he climbed the ladder. The sound of artillery fire swelled into a deafening chorus, 400 guns roaring as British shells rained on the German front. But as the men surged forward, the familiar whine of returning shrapnel tore through the air. The first explosions erupted above them, not solid shells, but airbursts. The sky itself seemed to fragment, flinging jagged steel in every direction. Hensley ducked instinctively, feeling something sharp glance off his helmet with a metallic ping. A hot vibration crawled through the steel, but his skull remained intact. Around him, men stumbled, clutching arms and legs, but fewer fell bleeding from the head than before. Hours later, as the attack faltered and the wounded limped back to the line, the medics began to notice. The familiar crimson-soaked bandages wrapped around shattered skulls were fewer. The casualty reports told the same story. Severe head wounds had dropped sharply. At a nearby dressing station, Captain Leon Brodie, the designer's cousin and an engineer himself, examined a helmet peppered with shrapnel dents. If this hadn't been on him, he muttered, he'd be gone. That night, the campfire glow flickered on rows of dented steel helmets stacked beside their exhausted owners. The laughter that once filled the tents had faded into grudging respect. Even the German prisoners, many with bandaged heads from their soft caps, eyed the British tin hats with something that looked very much like envy. But the true test of this strange, bowl-shaped helmet was only beginning. Because above the quiet hum of night, distant guns still thundered, and the sky was far from done raining steel. January 1916. Near Ypres, Belgium. The Western Front was frozen, a grim wasteland of wire and corpses locked beneath snow and fog. The men had learned to live with the sound of shells, not the solid boom of impact, but the dreadful shriek whistle that came before it. That sound meant shrapnel, death from above, unseen and merciless. Inside a dugout reinforced with sandbags and corrugated iron, a group of engineers from the British Ordnance Department huddled around a candlelit table. On it lay a collection of battered helmets, each pocked with impact marks and bent edges. Among them sat Major John Leopold Brodie, the man whose name now clung to the steel bowl every soldier wore. He leaned forward, brushing his thumb over a dent the size of a coin. "This one stopped a fragment moving at nearly 200 meters per second," Brodie said quietly. "A fraction lower, and it would have split his skull." Another officer exhaled slowly. "So the shape works, then?" Brodie nodded. "It disperses the force. The shallow brim catches shrapnel that falls at an angle. The dome deflects. It's crude, yes, but effective. The men can't see it, but this saves more lives than they'll ever know." Outside, soldiers tramped past with their rifles slung and coats stiff with frost. Private Hensley was among them, the same bowl of steel now etched with battle scars. He'd stopped mocking it long ago. A graze from a fragment at loose had convinced him enough. The little dent still marked where his luck had changed. The German trenches were close, sometimes less than 100 meters away. From across no man's land came bursts of laughter and shouted taunts in rough English. "Nice pots, Tommy!" the British answered with quiet grins. They didn't bother replying anymore. By mid-1916, casualty reports from the Royal Army Medical Corps painted a stark contrast. Before the helmet's introduction, nearly 1 in 5 wounded soldiers had suffered head injuries. Now, that number had dropped by over 70%. The figures spread through the ranks faster than rumor. Men began to paint their helmets, personalize them, a talisman, a piece of home steel that had earned its place. In German command posts, the reports caused unease. Intelligence officers noted the change in British survival rates. Colonel Rauscher of the Bavarian army scribbled a memo in February. Enemy now equipped with protective headgear of practical design. Recommend similar development for Imperial troops. But old habits died hard. Many senior officers still clung to the romantic image of the spiked pickelhaube, proud, imperial, and utterly useless in the era of machine guns and artillery. When orders came to phase it out, veterans scoffed. Then came Verdun. In that endless storm of fire and splintered bone, the French Adrian helmet, inspired by the British design, saved tens of thousands of lives. German observers saw the truth in the cratered corpses. Leather and brass were no match for shrapnel. By the end of the year, the laughter stopped. The tin hats had become symbols of survival, and soon the Germans would forge their own. But before imitation came pride and resistance. The story of how the British helmet reshaped the very look of war was still unfolding, one rivet at a time. March 1916. Verdun, France. The earth was shaking. Not from any single explosion, but from a constant, rolling drum fire that never stopped, day or night. The French called it El-Offer, the hell. Men disappeared into the mud and smoke, their bodies buried beneath cascades of splintered iron. In a German forward trench, Lieutenant Franz Eberhardt crouched beneath a shattered timber beam. The air stank of cordite and burned flesh. He held his pickelhaube in his hands, or what was left of it. The brass spike had been sheared clean off, and the leather was torn like parchment. A jagged piece of shrapnel had cut across his scalp, leaving a raw groove that still bled through the bandage tied around his head. He looked up at the wounded stumbling past, many clutching similar head wounds. "It's madness," he muttered. "We fight an artillery war wearing parade hats." In Berlin, military engineers were already drawing up sketches. The Army Weapons Testing Office at Charlottenburg had taken note of the British Brodie helmet's success and the French Adrian. They began experiments with new prototypes, deeper, heavier, and forged from thick steel plates. Colonel Friedrich Schwerd of the Technical Institute of Hanover was tasked with developing what would become the Stahlhelm, the steel helmet. By December 1915, the first prototypes were sent to the front. Unlike the British design, the German model wrapped around the ears and neck, offering more complete coverage. The men laughed when they first saw it. "You expect us to wear coal buckets now?" But after Verdun, no one joked. When the Stahlhelm was officially introduced in early 1916, the transformation was immediate. Head wounds among German troops dropped dramatically, mirroring what the British had already discovered. The design's distinctive flared sides and heavy brow gave it a sinister silhouette, but it was practical, a product of necessity, not pride. Lieutenant Eberhardt received his new issue in a wooden crate marked Here's Argentum, Army property. He turned it in his hands, feeling the weight, smelling the fresh oil on the steel. When he put it on, it settled deep and secure, muffling the chaos around him. For the first time, he felt protected. Across the lines, British observers noticed the change. Through binoculars, Private Hensley's sergeant muttered, "Well, look at that. Now they're wearing pots." Hensley smirked. "Guess the joke's on them, eh?" The war had changed forever. The sight of gleaming brass and bright leather was gone. From that point on, war belonged to steel, dull, practical, unglamorous steel. The Brodie and the Stahlhelm would define the faces of two armies locked in mortal struggle. Each one born from mockery, refined by blood, and hardened in the furnace of modern warfare. But the legacy of the tin hat wouldn't end with the armistice. When the next World War came, faster, louder, and deadlier, those same curved silhouettes would return to the battlefield once more. And once again, they would save thousands. November 11, 1918. Mons, Belgium. At 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. Private Arthur Hensley sat in the mud, his Brodie helmet tipped back on his head, and listened to the echo fade into nothing. After 4 years of thunder, the quiet was deafening. Around him, men stared across no man's land, an empty, cratered graveyard that had swallowed their youth. Hensley turned the helmet over in his hands. The once olive paint was chipped, the rim dented, the liner stained dark with sweat and grime. He ran his finger over the old scar where a shard of shell had struck 2 years before. The mark had become almost a signature of survival. He didn't know it yet, but that battered piece of steel would outlast the empire it was made to defend. When the soldiers came home, they brought their helmets with them, hung on pegs stored in attics, displayed on mantles like relics of endurance. The War Office continued to refine the design through the 1920s, giving rise to the Mark II, slightly deeper and stronger. The Americans had made their own version, the M1917, virtually identical, and carried it proudly through their first Great War. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Stahlhelm became a symbol of resilience and national pride. Its menacing profile marched again in parades through the 1930s, reshaped and modernized under a new flag. When the world plunged once more into global war, those same helmets, British, German, American, faced each other again across the battlefields of Europe and North Africa. It was a bitter irony. The helmets born from mockery in the mud of Flanders now defined an entire generation of soldiers. In 1940, during the Blitz, British civilians huddled in bomb shelters wearing updated Brodies, the civil defense helmets issued to wardens, firefighters, and ambulance crews. The design, nearly 3 decades old, still worked. When shrapnel from German bombs rained across London, the same curved steel shielded heads just as it had in Ypres and Loos. Historians later called it the simplest, most efficient design of its time, a product of practicality over aesthetics. Its wide brim caught falling fragments from above, perfect for trench and urban warfare. Soldiers who once laughed at its shape learned to trust it more than luck, prayer, or superstition. By war's end, millions of Brodie-style helmets had been made, stamped, riveted, and shipped to every corner of the British Empire. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, the tin hat had become a universal symbol of the common soldier, not glamorous, not heroic, but enduring. In the decades that followed, the world's militaries would evolve beyond steel, crafting lighter, stronger composites. Yet even as helmets changed, the principle remained: protect the head, save the soldier. Back in Yorkshire, long after the guns of Europe had gone silent, Arthur Hensley's grandson would find that old dented helmet in a wooden trunk. Inside the rim, faintly scratched, were the words, "Loose, 1915, it stopped death." And perhaps that was all it ever needed to do,